online edition produced by the Wadena County Historical Society and Travel and Storyteller in collaboration with the New York Mills Regional Cultural Center. BookEnds is made possible by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Five Wings Arts Council, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. BookEnds programs from previous authors are now available on the website of the Wadena County Historical Society at www.wadenacountyhistory.org. Today's program will also be available on the website shortly. Next month's BookEnds will be held Saturday, May 14th, 2022, and will feature Amy Sullivan, author of the nonfiction book Opioid Reckoning: Love, Loss, and Redemption in the Rehab State. This month's book speaker is Mark Vinz, who will talk about his latest book of poetry, The Trouble with Daydreams, Selected and New Poems. An icon of literary culture on the Northern Plains, Mark Vinz observes the details, be they dreary or delightful, of real life. Through concise language and powerful imagery, he conveys his memories, marked more by the present than the past, with clarity and affection. His most recent book was published in September 2021. If you have questions for today's author, feel free to enter them through chat. Now, welcome to BookEnds Online Edition, Mark Vinz.
Good morning.
Thanks for your patience.
Okay.
So if you would like to start us out, why don't you read us a poem from The Trouble with Daydreams?
Well,
Perhaps one that's very pretty close to you, maybe the one that launched the start of this collection.
Well, this is it says collected on the cover, but it's selected. In other words, I've gone through 50 years of poetry and had to pick. It's like, which children do you want to live? You know. And I had to pick the ones I wanted to save. And so if it was collected poem, it would be huge. And I wouldn't want most of them published. So this is the title. I'll read the title poem because it says, I think, a lot about, you know, if you look at the cover, you got a snowstorm and the sun shining in the middle of it. Now that's sort of my life, you know, sun shining in the middle of a snowstorm. Hope in the middle of trouble. Trouble with, oh, I got the wrong page. I should want to. That's what happens when you have a new book. You don't know where anything is anymore. I got one called The Trouble with Poems. All right, I'll read that. This is called The Trouble with Poems. Say that you're reading this poem. Something you don't want to happen does. You remember your father chasing you down the street with his belt. What was it you did? Can you remember? Or were there too many times to remember? That's the trouble with poems. You never really know just where they're going to take you. Like this late afternoon light, and outside the window, trees laden with cones, bowing like dancers in the wind. That's better, isn't it? Then what about that wind, the storm coming, the trees disappearing into waves of snow, and you stuck somewhere miles from home in a snowdrift with no more than a few minutes of gas left in the tank that you should have filled yesterday, but you forgot. And now you might die alone way out here because you're stupid, because you don't know how you'll ever explain this to your father, who's out searching for you. Poems are like that, you say. And he just looks at you and shakes his head. If I had my belt with me, he says, I'd teach you about poems. And you know, he already has. So that has to do with the sense of poems. You never know where they're going to take you, through memory, through good times, through bad times. And you just have to learn to live with that, to go with that. And as the great French poet Paul Valéry said, a poem is never finished, only abandoned. And that's what I tell my students in the workshop. Is your poem abandoned enough to present to other people to read? So.
Tell us how you decided to become a poet instead of a prose writer.
Well, that's the way I started out. I was in college at the University of Kansas, national champions, by the way, in basketball. And I was really trying hard to write prose. That was my interest. And it became one of my teaching interests. But I was just having a hard time with things like plot. And one of the people, a good friend of mine who was in the workshop with me, said, "Why don't you try poems?" So I did. And I had a lot better luck with that. So I didn't really start writing poems till I was maybe a junior in college. I'd screwed around with things, but seriously, no. And the last thing was when I took a job at then Moorhead State College. Tom McGrath, an internationally known poet, was there and became a close friend and became my mentor. And he really helped me find out what a poem was and what I wanted to do, and took off from there. So unlike a lot of my students, I was a bit older when I really got serious about writing. No childhood stuff. That came later.
So would you say that one of the differences between poetry and prose is that poems focus more on an emotion or a feeling or a moment, whereas prose leans more towards plot and character development and situation?
Yes, absolutely. Although James Joyce borrowed a word from the Christian church, epiphany. The Feast of Epiphany is when the wise men came to see the Christ child and were overcome. And he said, that's the way both poetry and fiction should work. You should come to an epiphany, a startling realization, from what you've read. And that's what I really believe in about poetry. Poetry is of the moment, you're right. You don't have time to develop a character or a plot. A lot of poems have plot, like the one I just read. There's a kind of a plot there. It's an imaginary plot, but it's nonetheless a plot. So there's a long-winded answer.
So do you have, I have not actually seen your book of poetry yet, so I'm a little unprepared. I apologize.
Okay.
Do you have does your poetry focus more on nature or a feeling?
I've gone through so many stages. I think a poet has to be open. And Robert Frost said, you can't call yourself a poet. That's for other people to do. So I don't call myself a poet. I call myself a writer. And you go through so many things. You're right. My writing has changed. Early poems tended to be about a place. What am I doing here? I came here for my first job at Moorhead State in 1968, and I've been here ever since. I was going to be here 2 or 3 years. I came here from the University of New Mexico, where I finished graduate school, which is about as different from here as you can get. So I was struck right away. Tom McGrath used to ask his class, why does the Red River flow north? Why doesn't it flow south like most other rivers? There's wonderful things to discover about a place. The prairies, the lakes, the hills. So a lot of it had to do with place. Family, I became reacquainted with my family. Both my parents grew up in this region. My mother from North Dakota, my father from Minnesota, over near you. My father grew up in Prose. And I had to relearn all these family stories and things I never knew. And of course, they became things I had to write about, discover, try to figure out what they meant. Dreams, I wrote nothing but dreams for a long time. Politics, you name it. And I think a writer has to be open to any possibility. I'm trying to find that thing that makes it unique, worth writing about. That's a lot. Okay. That's my English professor's side.
Would you like to share another poem with us?
Sure. This is one that just happened one day. I'm walking to school. That's one thing I loved about it. I lived in Moorhead and I walked to school. And I'm walking to school and there's this guy sitting on a swing set. And that's what provoked this poem. So I say, you never know. It's called A Man of Learning. It's always there, isn't it? Even when I don't read the newspapers or watch TV, it's the cancer story I overhear in the drugstore. Sad songs on radios, faces in passing cars, the toothless man who stops me on my way home to borrow the 44 cents he's short of for a bottle. You know, he says, you look to me like a man of learning. He can spot us, he says. Always good for some spare change. He's the one I wonder about tonight, waiting for the calm between the freight train shrieks and the morning birds. You need a hobby, my father used to say when I'd tell him what was bothering me. Like the times they herded us to the school basement for A-bomb drills, how they told us to tuck our heads between our knees and cover our necks with hands, and how I didn't ever want to leave those shadowed hallways, afraid that what I'd find when we got above ground. Or maybe I didn't tell him after all. I have to wonder about that too, fumbling for small change in the bedclothes, and beside me, the clock radio patiently shuffles its numbers, gathering news. And we don't have clock radios anymore, but we did when I wrote that poem. Yeah. So that poem probably goes back to the 70s, you know, or 80s, probably.
If it's not broken, why would you get rid of it?
Right. I agree.
So if we're talking about poems in the context of, are you ready to abandon it yet? What's your process for writing a poem? Do you draft and put it in a drawer and then come back? Do you have a circle of readers?
Yes. I have had readers. I have had writing groups. I don't at present, but that really helps. I think there are two things that helps a beginning writer, and one is reading, because a lot of the people that want to send me poems have no idea what a poem is, and you find that out from reading. And the other is from getting constructive criticism. And one word I ban in my writer workshops is the word nice. So I never want to hear that word. That means nothing. Well, how'd you like my work? Oh, it's nice. Well, tell me. Well, that third line was awful, and that's what you need to hear. And my process is revision, 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 revision. That's when you really learn. Maybe the poem ends up in a place you never intended. But that's what you discover from revision. William Matthews, who was a noted American poet, said, revision isn't cleaning up after the party. Revision is the party. I believe that's and getting students to revise is one of the hardest things as a teacher of creative writing, that they don't want to revise. I said this, it's great. That's my first thought. And I said, well, good. How long do you think it took Keats to write Ode to a Grecian Urn? Yeah, probably months. So no.
And not because he was doing it in longhand with the quill and the inkwell. It wasn't the physical process. Do you write in longhand, or have you transitioned to?
I finally transitioned to the computer. I can compose. For a long time, I couldn't compose on a computer, but now I do. And I have to wonder, and with poems, you know, the nice thing about the computer is you can see line breaks much more clearly than longhand. You begin figuring out where you want to break the line, what rhythm you're going to use, whether it's going to be regular rhythm or whether it's going to be free verse. You know, you learn by doing.
So what
There's
constitutes?
there's another quote I love. And it was the guy who wrote Ragtime, and I can't think of his name. And he said, writing creatively is like driving at night. You can only see as far as your headlights, but you can make the whole trip that way. That's my image for poetry. You're going along, you're doing this and that, but you don't know where you're going until you've been through it a few times. You can make the whole trip that way.
So for people who maybe do not know as much about poetry, which would probably include me, how do you define free verse? What marks a poem? What are things that it has to have or shouldn't have to make it a free verse? I mean, how do you write a free verse poem?
Well, free verse, some people think is just shredded prose, you know, but free verse has its own rules, its own cadences, you know. There you're more flying by what's right, what seems right, what feels to you. Whereas at the opposite extreme, you're dealing with a pattern, you know, like when, I mentioned Go to Grecian Urn, Keats was writing iambic pentameter, probably 10-syllable lines. You can read some of the great works, Shakespeare, who used the 10-syllable iambic line, Chaucer, Milton, you know, all the great poets of the past. And one reason for that is it's easier to memorize, because a lot of these people, you know, they didn't have printing. So it's easy, you know that from songs. It's easier to memorize songs than a prose paragraph, because you've got rhythm, you've got the meter, you've got the rhyme. And that's why all the early poems, you know, had that. And the revolution came in the beginning of the 20th century, and there's still a lot of people who say it's not a poem if it doesn't rhyme. But I'm terrible at rhymes, so I've never written poems.
So some of our earliest poetry, actually, right? Homer's Odyssey and Iliad.
Yeah.
That's all coming from spoken word storytelling.
Right.
And so to make it easier to remember, it had that rhythm, and
right.
then it was written down, and it comes out as a poem.
Eventually written down, and therefore, and you have different translations, and there's a lot of arguments, like the Bible, same thing, you know, same thing. But writing begins as an oral tradition, and for centuries was oral, wasn't written down.
So even with free verse, we have a certain rhythm that's going through every line, and a continuity of an image or an emotion or a theme that's carrying through.
Yes, well stated. All those things, yes. And that's what you discover as you revise. Yeah.
So why don't you select another poem to read to us?
Okay.
That
you know, one thing, when I started writing poems, they were all deathly serious. And what I've discovered is poems that can be funny as well. A friend of mine from graduate school is a Texan, grew up near San Antonio. And we decided, we did a book of poems together, which we wrote about our childhoods, and we had themes. And then we published, when the book was published, it was every other page, him and me. And it was amazing. He was growing up in the land of you know, of Hispanic food. I was growing up with Norwegian Lutherans, you know, it's really different. And yet there was a lot of sameness. So we had a ball writing that book. And this is the title poem. It's called In Harm's Way. No, I didn't write on myself as a child, no matter that my wife thinks all kids did. All I remember is a grown-up told me I'd get cancer from the ink or pencil lead and die. just as I would from pneumonia after going out with a wet head. But it was my classmates who gave me all those other useful cautionary tales, like swallowed seeds sprouting in your stomach, swallowed bubblegum sticking parts of your insides together, or excess frowning causing permanent damage to your face. How in the world did we ever survive? Even today, all these years later, you can tell us by our cavernous looks, our gurgling guts, the tiny tendrils that won't stop sprouting from our ears. There's a story. That was just fun. That was just letting off steam. But, you know, I grew up with so many aphorisms that didn't make any sense to me as an adult. So
like
I got
getting along like a house on fire.
yeah. But we were always warm. You know, if you swallow a seed, it'll grow inside you. What? You
Will
know,
come sprouting out.
out your ears. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite humorous poem?
Well, I thought that one was humorous, but see if I can find it. I wrote all this stuff very carefully down, and now it doesn't make any sense to me.
How
Being a
about
teacher,
read Letters to the Poetry Editor?
oh my goodness. Yeah, I'll read some of those, but I want to read this one first. This was a poem that was published in a magazine called College English. And I got letters from people saying, your poem is posted on our refrigerator. It's called The Former Student. And it's something, if you're a teacher, you end up writing about your students. It's inevitable. Even from the corner booth, you notice something familiar in the bartender's eyes. Don't you remember me? The former student speaks, reminds you how he still hates to read the kinds of books you teach. At the lake, he's the one with muscles and the dripping tan, the irritated waitress on the midnight shift, the mechanic who bludgeons you with words like compression ratio and solenoid. Nudge, a pointing finger, and a stare, as if you can't survive the space outside your office walls. He does your taxes, fixes every leak, loads your groceries, guides you to your seat. When you visit the clinic for the final check on your vasectomy, he's the one in charge of sperm samples. The teller who sniffs your paycheck, the head waiter leering at the holes in your socks. Alone at last in the parking lot, you belch and sigh and scratch. Guess who steps out from behind a parked car? There's no privacy in the teacher's life. You're always spotted. So that's a humorous poem that probably didn't start that way. It probably started as a more serious kind of poem, and it became humorous. The Letters to the Poetry Editor was early on. It was one of my first published books. I think it was the second one, 1975, from a press, Capra Press in California, which published chapbooks. And a chapbook is simply a small collection by one author. And people who sold broadsides and things on street corners were called chapmen. Chap is a British word that has to do with mouth. So it has chapmen, or hey, buy this, you know. So that's where chapbook comes from. Dear Sir, these are letters that I edited a poetry magazine for several years. And these are parodies of some of the letters I received. I'm a confessional poet from Decatur, Illinois. My mother is a librarian. My father sells used cars. My poems, as you will see, are mostly about snakes and sunsets. After all, How much is there to confess in Decatur, Illinois? Now, when I read that poem, a friend of mine was sitting near me, his name is James Moore, just read one of his poems in the New Yorker. And he happened to be from Decatur, Illinois, and he never let me forget that. To whom it may concern, no one knows how a poet suffers. These are some of my poems. They are about suffering. I've collected nearly 3,000 rejection slips in the last 5 years. Please send me one of yours. I'll read one more. Dear editor, this is the greatest poem I have written thus far. I am told that when poets complete a work, they appear in some kind of literary magazine. I am now ready to appear. People don't have any idea how publishing works. You know, I'm asked, well, when are you going to bring out your next book? Well, when I find somebody that's going to publish it for me. In this case, North Dakota State University Press, and I'm very grateful for that. But people just don't understand the whole act. You know, publishing is a long, hard thing, and it's like revising. It's something you go through. It's the business of poetry. It's the least interesting part of poetry as far as I'm concerned. The process, writing the poem, that's the joy, that's the important thing. Getting it published is nice, but it's not what it's all about finally. So that's why I'm especially glad to have a book like this, which captures some of the poems I want to say from many, probably 50 years of poetry writing. So what else? I'm seeing a different person on the screen, and I'm not hearing you.
I'm sorry.
There you are.
Yes, I muted myself when my clock wanted to chime 12 times.
Okay.
So you must have file cabinets and file cabinets and file cabinets of poetry.
Well, I used to, but you know, when I retired and we moved, I had to get rid of a lot of that stuff. And a lot of the stuff you keep, you don't know why, but I've got a lot of papers from the editing and from my writing, and they're all going to the archives at the University of Minnesota. In fact, a lot of it's there already, and down to the last few boxes of stuff.
Do you keep the revisions all the way up to remind yourself of the process?
Once in a while. I used to do it all the time, and then that led to throwing out a lot of stuff, saying, why am I keeping this? You know, it's interesting to me, but probably not to anybody else. But once in a while, and once in a while, I've actually used it for magazines that want that sort of thing. Send me a poem in different versions, and I've been able to publish a couple of pieces like that. So, but generally, no.
So your poems deal a lot with memory
Yes.
and place.
Yes.
So we've talked, in addition to Decatur, Illinois, I mean, do we have any Minnesota poems?
Many. Let me try to find one. Well, as I said, my grandmother, my grandmother lived in Frazee, Minnesota, and I'm going to set this up, and then I'm not going to be able to find the poem, and I apologize for that. Okay, I got it. This is a poem from quite a while ago, but it was one of the first poems I wrote about this place, and it had to do with some of my grandmother's stories. And no, that wasn't the one. There it is. I'll just read you. It's a long poem. It's in 5 different sections, but this is the one. She lived in a really rundown house. She didn't have running water. She didn't have central heat. She had a wood stove, and a pump and an outhouse. And that was always fascinating to me. She was a real pioneer. And I'll read you the middle 2 sections of the poem. This poem means as much to me as any poem I've written, because it was the place I turned a corner and started getting interested in my family, my history, this place. They're all tied up. This is section 3. Once there were glaciers here, now only winter, and a terrible survivor's pride. I drive through fields of icy moonlight, remembering her tales. The man who froze to death, trying to unlock his front door, drunk and warm on a night like this, until they found him in the morning, still on his knees, with the key still in his hands. And the other is the families who died in snowdrifts when their cars broke down, the farmer who dropped through river ice with a team and wagon, whole generations disappearing into the glacial nights, and those who survive even the stalking blizzards, alone in unfamiliar beds, or driving endlessly towards first light. Stiff as a board, she said, with the key still in his hand. This is part 4. There is a house, gaunt and thin as this hand I hold, derelict for 7 years, mausoleum of mildew and shattered glass, walls sagging together like a child's watercolor. Only the necessities still work, outhouse, pump, and wood stove. She didn't want to leave. It was never very much, but it was mine. A widow, nearly 50 years in that house, but I provided 2 sons and just my sewing money through the lean years that never ended. I've put aside enough to bury me. See to it. And the lean wisdom garnered day to day. Don't count on much. Be neighborly and mind your business. Don't take too many baths. It weakens you. That was the thing about my grandmother. I call it survivor's pride, and it really is a part of this country. You think this is bad. How many times have you heard that?
Mhm.
You think this is bad. Well, when I was your age, I had, but that's it.
I tell my children all the time that, when I grew up, I had to walk to school uphill both ways.
Both ways. There you go. And the snow that was getting deeper all the time.
So you have that was a poem about your grandmother. Do you have other family members that are featured in your poetry?
Well, certainly. I'll read a love poem. I'm very bad at love poems, but I'll read one. I know where this one is. It's the last poem in the book. I grew up in Minneapolis, and then when I started high school, we moved to Kansas City. So I ended up going to high school there and eventually the University of Kansas. That's where I met my wife, who's from New Jersey. It's been as she calls it, a mixed marriage. Also, I'm a pessimist, she's an optimist. Anyway, we were coming home from a drive. We've been down in the Southwest. Our daughter at the time was living in Colorado Springs. So we decided to go home along the Platte River in Nebraska because it was about the time for the sandhill cranes. And that's what was the occasion for this poem. It's called Love Poem for Betsy. Once as we were driving home along the Platte in early March, we stopped, breathless, to watch as skies filled up with flocks of sandhill cranes. Resting here as always on their long flight north, wave upon wave, their formations blanketing the stubble fields in precise gray rows. A kind of love poem, I suppose. And like all love poems, something to remind us what we'll never really understand, nor need to. Well, see, I had no idea where that poem was going. I thought it was going to be about cranes, but it was about relationships. It was about love. And that's why I say sometimes Richard Hugo has a wonderful book called The Triggering Town, and he talks about what starts the poem isn't often what finishes it. It gets you going, it locates you, but then you find out what you really want to say. So I started this poem writing about Nebraska and sandhill cranes and ended up writing a love poem about what matters and what doesn't, and what you don't need to know, just accept. So,
I notice with your poetry that you go along in a way, and then with the last line, you completely shift the direction that almost makes you want to go back to the beginning of the poem
good.
and read it all again.
That's what I want. I think I learned that from reading Robert Frost endlessly. He did that. He liked to do that. And he had a quote: "No delight in the writer, no delight in the reader. No tears in the writer, no tears in the reader." You know, and I think that's another rule of writing poetry. I think you have to, communicate how you're feeling. I found the title poem. Can I read that?
Yes, please.
This goes back to an early classroom. I grew up in early grades in a place called Dinkytown, which is a part of Minneapolis near the University of Minnesota. And we shoot marbles, and we dig little pits and throw ante, and then you throw marbles, who gets closest. So this is the title poem, The Trouble with Daydreams. A necessary shield for everything that threatened me. I learned quite young the power of escape, the way that almost anything could provide it, at least for a little while. Take these marbles clicking in my pocket, Aggies, Clearys, Cat's Eyes, and the treasured steely shooter, ready for our recess games. I know the sheen of each and every one that's turned between my thumb and forefinger, stopped a moment by the pang of memory. The day I dropped my favorite and it bounced and rolled between the desks right up to teacher's feet. All she said was, what would hurt me the most? How she expected more from me, much more. And then that deep green friend had found a sunless home somewhere inside her desk. Here at last, light floods the windowsills. The shouts as someone's shooter stops just inches from the little pit we've dug, filled with hard-won marble antes. Winner takes all. And as we watch another shooter roll, my turn's next. Maybe today will be my lucky one. Hoping is what I'm good at after all. As everyone gathers to see the stash I for the moment won. And I still keep picturing the one that rolled away. So that's the trouble with daydreams. They can save you for a while. And I am a total daydreamer, but there's always that other thing that daydreams can't cover up. So that would be good poems. Yeah.
I think that it's fortunate for us that you have decided to daydream out loud.
Well, thank you. That's a way to put it, I think. Yeah, my original title for the book was simply Daydreamer, and I thought, well, that's too general. This is more specific. The trouble with daydreams are troublesome. My teachers always wrote that on my card. We didn't have letter grades in the primary grades. We had letters from the teacher, and every one of them, I found my mother had kept them all. Every one of them said he's a good student, but he's a hopeless daydreamer. So I was branded at a very early age.
And how about hopeful daydreaming? Do we have a poem of hopeful daydream filled with hope?
Not really. I've got one about daydream, but it's very sad because I really dislike school, and I'd find well, I think one of the lines in the poem, and I can't remember it. Oh, here it is. Okay. And this is my trouble with school. This is my exorcism of my trouble with school. And it has to do with daydreams. Hopeless case. I still can hear the name in sleep, snagged again on the paperclip fence of her resolve. Daydreamer, she cried as I wandered in forests of black script alphabets. Q was the one I could never get right. A backward letter, like I could be, she said. I wanted to scream into her thumbtack eyes, but crept away with pigeons on the sill. She tried to rescue me, I must say that, through all those days of groaning clocks, till my notebook rose and flapped away to a tiny inkblot in the clouds. Sometimes in nightmares we meet again, in deserted schoolrooms full of chalky smirks, as once again I struggle to recite all those lessons that were never learned because I was daydreaming. So that's not hopeful, but it explains it. That's what got me through school, daydreaming. So it was hopeful in that sense.
And what do you do when you catch students daydreaming in your class?
I try to wake them up. I don't know. Mostly I don't do anything. You know, if they're happy, I'll take that. Too many of them are beaten up by English teachers, so I just, okay.
How ironic for that feeling of hopelessness and at the memory of your own education, and now you are an educator.
Yeah, I've always thought that, and so many of the people I know who once were former students, I've always asked them the question, did you like school? And I said no, almost to a one. And I said that's why they became teachers. I suppose down there somewhere is think I can be different. I can do better.
And do you have a poem about being a teacher?
I have a poem. Well, the one I just read you, the one called Former Student. I'm trying. Oh, it's in here something. This is called Professor Emeritus. And this is about being a teacher and, again, former students. So how's retirement treating you, they ask. And there's still no good answer. I keep on learning day to day just what it is I miss, or thought I would and don't, or don't and should. Maybe I'll start mentioning those teacher dreams that come more often now. All those rooms I still can't find, the missing lecture notes, the blank face class I fail to recognize. Tomorrow will be Christmas Eve. I'm up before first light, the rhythms of the season, still what drives me from my bed. All papers finished, grades turned in, and now a little time to savor momentary silences. Yesterday, a former student met me with a hug. Another slapped my back in the supermarket line, full of season's cheer, and maybe something more. I have to wonder what they still remember after all these years, but glad they still remember it at all. So there's a poem about being a teacher. You take what you can get. There are good times, and sometimes you have to wait for them to happen.
And you never know, sometimes that moment that they got from your class might burst like an epiphany a decade later.
Yeah. That's happened to me many times. Oh, I remember when we did this, and huh? Yeah, absolutely. You sometimes don't know whether you're connecting or not. And especially in this part of the country where people tend to be very reticent. I mean, when I was a teaching assistant at the University of Kansas, Kansans are much more open, and moving here, all of us who came here to teach from different places, we all would go for a beer after work or something, and people would always ask that question, well, what do you do to get your students to talk? And that was our goal. And it was hard. Yeah.
So do you think that one of the functions of the poet is to be the keeper of memory, like the giver in Lois Lowry's The Giver, where there was one person who was the keeper of memory in the community?
I just saw that movie again. The Giver, with Jeff Bridges, as a matter of fact. Yes, the other night, I just watched that. Yes, absolutely. I was reading Richard Hugo again, one of my favorite poets, in his book, The Triggering Town, and he talks about the traditional role of the poet was that exactly. That was the chief role, memory, just like the monks in the monastery, writing it down. Keep those stories going and find somebody that's going to pass them on, and until they get written down. And that's why for a while I studied, I was very serious about studying folklore. I was fascinated by it. But if you study folklore, you study variants. There are so many changes. People, there's that old game, you tell something and you go around a circle, and by the time it comes around the circle, it's totally changed. And sometimes that happens with literature or songs, and sometimes there are floating verses that come in from another song. And it's just fascinating. And yeah, so I've always been interested in stories and the metamorphosis they go through. Yeah.
I think one of the traditional questions that gets asked in these kinds of venues is, what's your favorite poem or your favorite book, or your, and I would actually like to ask, which of your poetry, could you read a poem that you think that you struggled the most with to say, to give to the world? The one that you're still not sure about.
Wow. You're talking about how many of them. I don't know. I think that this is
Okay.
Well, here's one. This is I read Grandma. This is my father. And the line comes from the Bible, through glass darkly. Each morning, as I ease arthritic aches from bed, I can hear my father in the dim hallway ahead of me. That string of childhood markers, I've come to call his sound. Groan and sigh and throat cleared in the bathroom mirror, where once again we hail each other, still tentative, eyes shifting to any convenient corner. Maybe now I've finally come of age. Hand raised toward the glass, fingers slowly reaching toward themselves. That's one of the hardest endings I've ever. I waited a long time for that ending to come to me, staring in the glass and seeing my father, but that image of my hand reaching and the hand coming to reach, yeah, that was very difficult. And I can't say I'm unsure of it. I think I hit it, but you never know. Too many people say I just never understood poetry, and the teacher always had the right answer, and I don't. And that's, I think, is the biggest challenge, trying to make students feel good, see the wonderful metaphors, see those things.
My first English literature, whatever, required class in college was actually all about poetry. And the most beautiful thing that teacher told me was that there's no wrong answer when you read the poem, that what you bring to the poem and the feeling that you get, that's the truth right there. And it's a conversation, and so it'll be a different conversation with every single person who reads the poem.
Yeah, I agree. John Ciardi, who's a famous American poet, had a metaphor for reading a poem. He says it's like dropping a rock in the pool of water and you get concentric circles. Maybe the ones toward the center are the ones people can agree on or write about, but out there towards the edge are your personal feelings, and they're just as valid. Absolutely. You maybe don't want to share them, but they're there, and yeah, you can't deny them either. So
that is one of my most viewed. That's a beautiful image, and actually the stone in a pond with the circles, that's something that I carry with me to carry, and apply to so many parts of my life.
yeah.
I think that I've really dominated and been asking all of the questions. I don't know if
I've
anybody
loved
else
it.
has any other questions that they want to ask. If they can type them in chat, and I will ask them for them. I know I read more science fiction than I read poetry. I do read some poetry, but one of the things that they talk about in science fiction is that it's a conversation, and each book that's published is a response to another author's commentary on something.
Right.
Do you think poetry and follows that at all, where your poems, your book of poetry is part of a larger conversation that you're having with other poets about memory?
Absolutely. I think that when I tell my students to read poetry to find out what a poem is, they think I'm suggesting they copy it. No, I mean, musicians go to concerts, painters go to art galleries, poets read poetry, and that's something you learn, and it's a part of a conversation. And it's a good book of poetry if it encourages me towards one of my own. My poem is going to be very different, but it's there, and that's a part of that conversation we're talking about. Right? That way. Yeah, my favorite poet still remains Robert Frost, and James Wright, a contemporary poet who lived in Minnesota. Used to hang out with one of my friends, the late Robert Bly. So these are people who made me aware, along with Tom McGrath, of writing about place and writing about relating to stories and things like that.
I think the last James Linsky, A Marriage, that would be the last book of poetry that I purchased.
Mm-hmm.
So in conclusion, we're getting towards the end. Tell us a little bit about what your plans are for the future. What are you going to do next?
I have been working on a manuscript, which I thought was almost done, but it keeps growing, of nonfiction. And someone once said, poetry has more in common with nonfiction than anything else. And because it involves a kind of truth telling. And not the fiction writer imagines things, So I wrote fiction seriously for a few years back in the 80s, and then I got tired of it. I wanted to go back to nonfiction. So anyway, this is a book about writers and writing. Writers that I've known, can tell stories about, suggestions for writing, on poetry, on other kinds of writing. So I've been having a lot of fun with that, but it's a project I thought it'd be done by now, but it's not. So that's what I'm doing, nonfiction, occasional poem, very occasional.
Well, That is just absolutely wonderful to hear, and I look forward to looking for that book.
Okay.
And
Even Donald Hall
I
is
think-
one of my favorite writers, and his book is called Essays After 80. He said he revised each one of those essays between 60 and 80 times. And I could see that for a poem, but for an essay? I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Would you like to close with one more poem?
Sure. Probably my best friend is a guy named Joe Richardson, and for a few years we co-ran a distribution. That's the big problem with independent writing, with nonprofit writing, as poetry tends to be. And we'd go off to book fairs, you know, and this particular one, we were off trying to sell books by Midwestern authors, Midwestern presses in South Dakota, and it was one of those 110-degree days or whatever. It seemed like that. And this has to do with coming home and an epiphany. The barn was empty, falling down. The windmill bent like a discarded paper hat. We passed 100 like it, talked of mountains, surf, anything to keep us from the heat and dying corn, until we stopped to watch an orange moon rise and string our breaths across those cooling fields, going nowhere, but going home. Yeah. That's another sort of main theme, going nowhere. I live in the flyover, but you know, we got all kinds of good things going on here.
And there's the 8 chimes that say that we've come to half past the hour. And so this edition of Bookends Online, unfortunately, must come to a close.
Well,
Yeah.
I've enjoyed myself. I love
Thank
to
you.
talk, as you've probably figured out.
Thank you.
Yes,
You were
right.
one of my idols.
Oh, bless you.
Yes, I have loved your poetry for years.
Oh. And you've been writing yours for
I've been
what?
writing mine for seriously probably only about 10 years.
Oh.
You know, I dabbled before, but
That's good. That's good. That's a big change, isn't it? From
Yeah.
dabbling to really getting serious. Yeah, I remember that.
yeah,
That happened when I moved here.
yeah. I've been more of a midwife than a poet. The last couple of years, I've been putting together ways for poets to share their work
Yes. I know
online and by Zoom, stuff like that. But I need to get back to writing my own.
Yeah. That's the problem with all these other things they take away finally. So when you retire, you know, when I retired, I finally said, no, I'm not doing this, but it doesn't work because you still end up, you know, doing something.
Yeah, there's still other things that call to you.
Yeah. Or somebody wants a blurb written for a new book or something, you know, so you want to just say, no, I'm not.
Yeah.
Well, you
Well,
do it.
Thank you. And I'm so delighted to have a copy of your new book. And I'm going to dedicate the rest of the week to that.
Oh, bless you. I love that. Thank you very much.